Okay, 7th grade, I am going to be reading to you from the Screwtape letters. We're going to look at letters 1, 2, and 3. Remember, you can do this. You have the PDF. There is an audiobook from YouTube. I'm going to talk a little bit as I go through this to give you some more information, some things to talk about, kind of like as if we were in class discussing this. But here we go. So, letter 1. Let's try that again. Letter 1. My dear Wormwood, I note that what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you supposed that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were preparing to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. So what Screwtape is saying is that our patient, who is the guy that Wormwood is trying to keep from God, has this materialist friend that he likes to argue with. Remember, materialism is like the focus on the physical, wanting all of the things, buying things, materialistic, that kind of thing. So Wormwood is saying it's not a bad plan, but there are some better ways to do things. I don't know if you can hear my family in the background. I'm in the basement, but they're running around upstairs and it's really loud. I'm sorry. But with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or useless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future, that's the sort of thing he cares about. So jargon is like specific language for a specific group of people, like technical language we learned about before break. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly inferior of our Father below. But the very act of arguing, you wake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fit his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life and don't let him ask what it means by real. So he's saying if you get your patient to argue, that he's going to start thinking about things, and we don't want his mind to wander into those issues. We want to keep him focused on what we want him to think. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, the abominable advantage of the enemies. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and began to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made a counter-suggestion. You know how no one can ever quite overhear what he says to them. This was much more important than lunch. At least, I think it must have been his line of thinking, when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle by the end of the morning, the patient ended up considerably The patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway out the door. So we see here Screwtape's philosophy with this person. They started to think something that was leaning towards God, and he says the enemy, who's God. God is the enemy of Screwtape in this book. The enemy was pushing that thought, like, think those things about me, right? And Screwtape convinces the patient that it's time for lunch, and it would be far better if he came back and thought about that thing after lunch, and gets him distracted off of this thought that he had about God. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past, and before I reached the bottom of the steps, I got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he'd had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense of actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He's now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see my point? Thanks to the process which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. We've talked about that before, right? Like sometimes it's difficult to understand God because we can't see him or touch him, but there's people here with us that we can see and physically talk to. Keep pressing home on the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science. And he says, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't see and touch. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from the invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of modern investigation. Do remember you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So this is letter 1. We got to keep him distracted. We got to keep him focused on things that are real. We have to keep him from thinking about God and Christianity and anything like that. Letter 2. My dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Indeed, in your better moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. One of the great allies at present is the church itself. Think about that. How can the church itself be an ally to these demons? Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. Fortunately, it is quite invisible to see these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer, with rather an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. When he gets to his pew and looks around him, he sees just that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces next to him. It's matters it matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior on the enemy's side. No matter. Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool. Provided that any of those neighbors sings out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind which he supposes to be spiritual, but which in fact is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that the other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty for him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expected them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the particular kind of clarity which hell affords. Work hard, then, on the disappointment or anticlimax which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. It occurs when the boy who has been enchanted by the nursery by the stories from the Odyssey buckles down to really learning Greek. It occurs when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks a transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses with his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with these two-legged animals. So what Screwtape is talking about here is this free will, that we love God even in the mundane things, that when things get difficult or boring, we still choose to follow him. And that's what Screwtape's talking about. He's saying, let that happen because we can manipulate that situation and bring him back to us. He sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own. Talking about the enemy or God again. There lies our opportunity, but also remember there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt. I've been writing hitherto on the assumption that the people in the next pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Of course, if they do, if the patient knows that the woman with the absurd hat is a fanatical bridge player, or the man with squeaky boots is a miser and an extortioner, then your task is so much the easier. All you then have to do is keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider that I am in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? Ben's trying to sneak in, if you can hear him. There he is. You may ask whether it is possible to keep such an obvious thought from occurring even to a human mind. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly and simply. Don't come into his head. He has not been anything like long enough with the enemy to have any real humility yet. What he says, even on his knees, about his own sinfulness is all parrot talk. At bottom, he still believes he has run up a very favorable credit balance in the enemy's ledger by allowing himself to be converted, and thinks he is showing great humility and condescension in going to church with all these smug, commonplace neighbors at all. Keep him in that state of mind as long as you can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So, our patients become a Christian, but we're going to use the devices of the church against him to keep him from fully committing to God. So think about those moments that you've had, right? This is very universal, meaning it applies in a lot of places. Like, maybe you're not running around church pointing at people and saying, like, oh, they're bad, or oh, they do this, or oh, they do that. But sometimes those moments where, like, somebody annoys us, and that can really just throw off our day or our worship experience or whatever. So this is the thing that Screwtape is telling Wormwood to capitalize on. Like, use these moments against your patient. All right, letter 3. We're almost done. Dear Wormwood, I am very pleased by what you tell me about this man's relations with his mother, but you must press your advantage. The enemy will be working from the center outwards, gradually bringing more and more of the patient's conduct under the new standard, and may reach his behavior to the old lady at any moment. You want to get in first. Keep close touch with our colleague Glubos, who is in charge of the mother, and build up between you and that house a good settled habit of mutual annoyance, daily pinpricks. The following methods are useful. So apparently there's conflict with the patient's mother, and we're going to use that against him as well. Number 1, keep in mind the inner life. He thinks his conversion is something inside him, and his attention is therefore chiefly turned at present to the states of his own mind, or rather to that very expurgated version of them, which is all you should allow him to see. Encourage this. Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate that most useful human characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself, which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. So keep his flaws hidden from him. Number 2, it is no doubt impossible to prevent his praying for his mother, but we have means of rendering the prayers innocuous. Innocuous means harmless. Like, let him pray, but let's direct his prayers so that they don't really work. Make sure that they are always very spiritual, that he is always concerned with the state of her soul and never with her rheumatism. 2 advantages will follow. In the first place, his attention will be kept on what he regards as her sins, by which, with little guidance from you, he can be induced to mean any of her actions which are inconvenient or irritating to himself. So if they keep the focus of his prayer spiritual, he will focus on all of the flaws of his mother that he's praying about. Thus, you can keep rubbing the wounds of the day a little sorer even while he is on his knees. The operation is not at all difficult, and you will find it very entertaining. In the second place, since his ideas about her soul will be very crude and often erroneous, he will, in some degree, be praying for an imaginary person, and it will be your task to make that imaginary person daily less and less like the real mother, the sharp-tongued old lady at the breakfast table. In time, you may get the cleavage so wide that no thought or feeling from his prayers for the imagined mother will ever flow into his treatment of the real one. I have had patients of my own so well in hand that they could be turned at a moment's notice from impassioned prayer for a wife's or a son's soul to beating or insulting the real wife or son without qualm. Number 3, when 2 humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost endurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring fully into consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrow which he learned to dislike in the nursery, and let him think how much he dislikes it. Let him assume that she knows how annoying it is and does it to annoy. If you know your job, he will not notice the immense improbability of the assumption. And, of course, never let him suspect that he has tones and looks which similarly annoy her. As he cannot see or hear himself, this is easily managed. So, let him be annoyed, but let him think that he is not annoying. Number 4, in civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which would appear quite harmless on paper. The words are not offensive, but in such a voice or at such a moment that they are not far short of a blow in the face. To keep this game up, you and Glubos must see to it that each of these 2 fools has a sort of double standard. Your patient must demand that all his own utterance are to be taken at their face value and judged simply on the actual words, while at the same time judging his mother's utterances with the fullest and most oversensitive interpretation of the tone and the context and the suspected intention. So we've talked about this before. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it or when you say it. And this is what Wormwood and Screwtape are going to maximize on. They're going to get this patient so annoyed with his mother that it doesn't matter what she says, he's going to be offended. And he's going to be offended when she calls him out on doing the same things. So they're going to get this conflict brewing. She must be encouraged to do the same to him. Hence, from every quarrel they can go away convinced, or very nearly convinced, that they are quite innocent. You know the kind of thing. I simply ask her what time dinner will be, and she flies into a temper. Once this habit is well established, you have the delightful situation of a human saying things with the express purpose of offending, and yet having a grievance when offense is taken. So he says, you're going to have him talking to his mother in order to offend her. His purpose in talking is offense. But when she's actually offended, then he's offended that he was offensive. Does that sound familiar? I'm sure none of you have ever done that before. Finally, tell me something about the old lady's religious position. Is she at all jealous of the new factor in her son's life? At all piqued that he should have learned from others, and so late what she considers she gave him such good opportunities of learning in childhood? Does she feel he is making a great deal of fuss about it, or that he's getting in on very easy terms? Remember the elder brother in the enemy's story? Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So think about that. Who's the elder brother? Think about a parable where there were two children and one was bad and then came back, and the elder sibling hadn't been bad and was offended that the younger was able to get in better with his father. Do you know what I'm talking about? Am I able to explain the prodigal son to you? That's what they're saying. Like, get this conflict going with mother and son. So that is the first 3 letters of the Screwtape letters. If you have any questions about that, email me, and we will look at more letters next week. Don't forget to answer the questions that are posted with this video.